Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Extra Atlas Podcast, where we explore some of the forces shaping Africa's future. This episode would be with Mr. Soji Maurice. He was the previous CEO of ATC Nigeria and is an infrastructure investment specialist. I hope you enjoyed the episode. This one would be a fun ride. Welcome to the show, Soji. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So, to me personally, at least from the little view of you that I saw, I think you've been a very inspirational figure in the infrastructure and telecommunication space. I do know you wear like a lot of hats, and I would like to start from that.
No pun intended, right?
No. No pun intended. I would like the audience, people listening, to actually try to get to know you in terms of the hats you wear before we get into anything personal on how your journey has been. So can you tell us some of the hats you wear?
Sure. Over the bulk of the last 15 years, I've spent my career in the telecoms space, focusing on infrastructure and providing more opportunities for connectivity. And that's still a hat I very much wear, and I'm happy of the work that has been done and is currently ongoing in terms of providing those opportunities for, like I said, connectivity. More recently, developed a passion for the rail infrastructure, and also currently developing a proposition for transport of cargo on our rail network in Nigeria, and that's going to be quite exciting in the coming years. And also, based on my background in architecture and real estate, I've also been a real estate developer and continue to do so. So it's many hats, but seemingly all revolving around infrastructure and providing, I think the bedrock of what Africa needs. When the world talks about things like AI and the like, you can't do all of that without infrastructure. They have a lot of that and we don't. And hopefully I get to play a role in laying the foundation for what should be a more digital future for Africa.
Yeah, I agree that infrastructure is probably, it has already been identified as something key, obviously. But I also think is probably one of the places we lack, and we really need to play a lot in that area in order to push our development forward as a nation, right? Recently, at least where I first got to know you was from attending a telco conference, if I remember correctly, that was organized by ATC.
Correct.
And I think that was the first time I met you. I don't think that was the first time you met me because I was not able to actually meet you. But you were introduced as the first Nigerian CEO of ATC Nigeria, and probably one of the youngest CEOs in Nigeria, right? I'm not so sure if that is still a thing in terms of one of the youngest CEO, but your journey with ATC, how was that? I also got introduced to ATC then.
Sure.
Working at MTN, I never really knew the companies that were sort of a backbone. I don't want to say the backbone. So that were sort of a backbone until I got to that conference, and I was actually open to a lot of information.
Sure.
So can you walk us through like your journey at ATC?
Sure. So I joined ATC about 7 years ago as commercial director, primarily responsible for growing the business. I mean, the business had been in Nigeria, I think, for about 3 years at that point in time, and had really struggled to expand and find opportunities for new business. Certainly not in the best of places, specifically, ironically enough, with MTN. I think we had limited new business from MTN. And working through that, trying to find those opportunities that made sense, exploring new lines of business outside of the core tower business, getting into rural telephony a bit, some fiber projects as well. Was successful enough and asked to move into a more operational role, which exposed me to sort of the other side of the business. Like you, sometimes when you're on one side, you don't realize all the stuff that's happening on the back end. So in many ways, that was also my own exposure to kind of how the bread was being made. And then after a while, after almost 2 years, then asked to then take over the leadership of the business, and until recently did that. And I think it was one of those opportunities that gave me perspective on, first and foremost, how difficult it is to get investment into Africa. When you're when you're faced with hyperinflation, when you're faced with devaluation, and you have investors in the case of ATC who sit very far away, who don't understand, how to cope with those levels of uncertainty when it comes to revenues. They gave dollars, so they're expecting dollar back. And so, in as much as you grow sometimes in Naira terms, in dollar terms, it's not enough for them, and continue to fight with other markets, because at the end of the day, there's limited capital, and the business has to make very intelligent decisions about where to put its capital. So I think, it was a great learning experience for me. And I think it's helped me in kind of what I'm doing right now, which also involves, by the way, raising capital at scale, to invest in infrastructure projects in Africa when you have people who aren't really comfortable with that level of uncertainty.
Right. Still looking at the ATC angle,
sure.
Right? I actually want people to understand how companies like ATC actually serve as a backbone for companies like MTN, Glo, Airtel. Because they hear MTN, Glo, Airtel, and they think that's where the buck stops in terms of infrastructure, in terms of, maybe my network is bad now, everything is on MTN, everything is on Airtel, everything is on Glo. So can you expand a bit more what companies like ATC actually do at the back end to support telcos?
Yeah, touching on some very delicate political, because especially with the recent tariff increase. But no, in all seriousness, I think for people who don't understand, the business of infrastructure or infrastructure sharing, which is really what companies like ATC and IHS do, is they allow the likes of MTN and Airtel generate sort of economies of scale by being more efficient. So let me just put it in context. A single tower can serve multiple customers. So in the early days, the likes of MTN and what was Equinet at the time were rolling out their own individual sites and only using their towers for their own benefits. As the business became more sort of encumbered, as competition started to drive margins down, they needed to find more efficient ways to utilize the infrastructure. So they started essentially sharing infrastructure where it made sense. But at some point, it became important to have a third party that was coming in and was saying, okay, we will manage this for multiple parties. And so that's where these kind of companies come into play. So you're right. A lot of the issues in terms of quality of service start with the provision of these services, which is really what we call passive infrastructure. So that means providing a space for ground equipment, providing towers at the right locations, at the right heights, and facing the right direction to allow for communication, point-to-point communication using the transmission network. And so, it doesn't matter how good, your network is. If at the end of the day there isn't power, which is a huge part of the business, and ensuring that power availability is as high as possible. And, we're in Nigeria here, we don't have a very effective grid. The logistics of moving things like diesel around isn't easy. It oftentimes comes with community issues and the like. So these companies really do play a key role in ensuring at a baseline that there is power and is access to the equipment that then the likes of MTN can then build upon, so to speak.
Right. There has been something that I've been curious about. Right. If these stations are being shared, then why would there be some sort of variation in, let's say, network strengths for two different providers that probably share a particular station? Sure.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first things you've got to realize that the only thing that the infrastructure providers provide really is powering these the equipment. The equipment oftentimes come from different manufacturers. They're using different spectrum. So they're using they're completely different. The only thing that is similar is that they're running, and in fact, you see in some cases, based on how the power is actually designed, you could have a power cut on one network and not on the other if there's an issue on one particular line. So there's still the independence of equipment and spectrum, and that leads to a very different quality of service. Now, that being said, I do think there's an opportunity for the likes of infrastructure providers to start to allow for what we call RAN sharing. So i.e. a third party providing the equipment on the towers that multiple MNOs can use. And then you'll probably see less variation in the quality of service across networks based on the locations. But that's a slightly separate conversation.
Right. So if the focus mainly is on power,
sure.
I think the conference that I first saw you at, one key theme around that conference among speakers that spoke was sustainability around the power. And I think you really excelled at that in terms of the numbers quoted then. If I remember correctly, I might be wrong, possibly 20% or 30% of power generated now are probably being generated by solar. So what sort of thoughts went into we needed, apart from what you just said in terms of moving diesel around, what sort of thoughts went into we needed more sustainable power, and what sort of roadblocks did you actually face in executing those particular maybe solar powers in stations? What are some of the problems you are facing and some of the gains that you made?
Okay, so I think the first thing is that the solar technology has evolved significantly in the last 10, 15 years in a way that allows for more power that can be generated per square meter, so to speak. So when you have that capacity, it then starts to make sense because these are very, very power hungry sites. So, you then need slightly less space than you used to need about 10, 15 years ago. The cost has also come down considerably as the likes of China and India have innovated in that space. And most importantly from my perspective at least, was that the cost of diesel was increasing quite significantly, especially in relative terms to income. So what that meant was that there was more pressure on diesel from a theft perspective. Communities wanted more. So the business case for solar just became far more interesting, from a financial perspective. So while there's obviously a huge drive towards sustainability and it is good for the environment, and I do believe that there was commitment for it from a sustainability perspective, it was also economically sustainable to try this technology. But it didn't come without, or it doesn't come without its own challenges, It does require some maintenance. You've got to make sure that those panels are cleaned and they're maintained. You can't just leave them alone and expect, there's that. There's also some opportunities for remote optimization based on the direction of the panels to adjust them sometimes during the course of the day. And there's some tools that I think were interesting, you might call them artificial intelligence, AI tools, but, they're just some tools that can allow you to also take advantage because every additional, measure of power that you can get, you're saving on diesel. And there's also batteries, by the way. So there's also been some innovation around batteries that allow for provision of even more capacity with limited space and cost. So I think taking advantage of what was happening in the ecosystem was key, and there'll probably be more. I think Nigeria has some opportunities in the solar. To take advantage of solar opportunities, certainly in the north and parts of, I believe, and I don't want to call any specific DISCO or IPP, but there are some interesting plans for solar farms that will provide more scalable power that's reliable, and that's the beauty of solar power. It's fairly reliable. Once you've made that investment, by and large, your costs can be managed after that in terms of O&M. And as long as weather patterns continue to remain the same, you can kind of predict how much you can get from it. So I think it's God's gift in many ways to certainly parts of Nigeria. Not all of Nigeria takes full advantage of it, but I think there's certain parts of Nigeria that can really take advantage of solar at scale.
Were there any major problems in adoption?
Of course. I mean, I think that I was talking about optimization. I think sometimes things were even improperly positioned. There were some knowledge gaps in terms of you have some being installed and they wouldn't be working and people wouldn't know. There were, like I said, there were lots of tools that were built around it to ensure that you were getting the benefits from it. But adoption and change management wasn't necessarily easy. Sometimes even in terms of the design, we had to learn how to put them in the right locations. You can have solar panels on the wrong side of your sites. You can have construction sites coming, or large buildings coming and shading your panels. So there was lots of learnings, but I don't think it's anything that's insurmountable. I think with any intentional leadership, you will ultimately reap the benefits of this at scale.
Right. You mentioned the use of AI. I think, not just thinking, everyone can see AI as one of the core emerging technologies disrupting the world currently. Are there a few, even with AI, that you think, not just people in the telecommunication space, not just people in the infrastructure space, but probably people in the technology space should actually put their minds on in terms of emerging technologies disrupting?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing that AI can help, before AI, the buzzword was sort of machine learning and big data, right? That was the thing. And AI is just an evolution of that. I think it's a buzzword that encapsulates a lot of what was already there. But I think taking advantage of what data is telling you. So if you think about, I'll give you an example. You could have, and this might not be technology, but maybe more so infrastructure. You have enough data, for example, or you should, using the right tools, to look at things like traffic patterns, to alternate how your roads work. So, for example, should Third Mainland Bridge have that big barrier in the middle and be this sort of dual carriageway? Or in the morning, should you be able to turn one of those two lanes into and then allow for reverse traffic to build more capacity? Can you automate it such that you don't need anybody there kind of directing traffic? There are lots of things. I mean, the use cases are endless. I think, again, ignoring the buzzword or ignoring what it means, I think just taking advantage of historical data and being intentional about making sure that you can quickly adjust as needed and allow machines do what they need to do. I think Africa can take advantage of it. I'll even use something even more basic. If you think about grid today, again, there's enough data that the discos can use to understand what usage patterns are. At a very basic level, can they start to communicate planned outages? Or maybe not all of them, so that you, Babatunde, knows that, okay, tomorrow I'm likely to only have power between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And that way I can plan my ironing, whatever it is that I need to do at a particular point in time and take advantage of it being there, or be at home then rather than not being at home. There are apps and things that they can use to communicate quite effectively. But there's so much. I think it just requires us to be intentional as a people and embrace technology. And that's why, without trying to prejudice your age, but I think your generation has an opportunity to really change the narrative if they don't follow any script and they say, let's solve our own problems by ourselves. There's enough out there that we can take advantage of.
Yeah, I agree. But there are certain gaps, right? AI requires a lot of data.
Sure.
Do we have the data? Maybe we do. Some people do. Let's say telcos do. Some large companies do. For example, you spoke about Third Mainland Bridge. Does Lagos government actually have that data? Maybe if they don't, do they need to approach, let's say, Google Maps, for example, to get such a data? What are some of the barriers you see that are gaps, really, in terms of either adopting these emerging technologies or actually putting this infrastructure in place? What sort of gaps?
I think it's collaboration. There's no doubt that data is missing. You're absolutely right. But I think it's about getting the right people in the room and being committed to driving it. Sometimes you have these workshops and these panels and people say the right things. Question is, what's happening after? What's happening in between? How are they behind the scenes sitting down and trying to truly collaboratively find the solution? Getting the data shouldn't be that difficult. But I think it's a will to collaborate and ultimately drive a change in our behavior. I think we're getting better, if I say so myself. The beauty of the world that we live in terms of how real time things are and how transparent it is going to be very clear very quickly. The leaders that are actually making an impact and those that aren't. You don't need propaganda. You don't need the newspaper to tell you. You'll see, and people are starting to take advantage of the access to information to drive change. But I think, to your point, if you don't have that collaboration, you're wasting your time. Yeah.
So you think the biggest barrier we face now is actually lack of collaboration, maybe across industries or with people, across businesses, maybe with even government and the private sector. Lack of collaboration across board.
100%.
But does collaboration really affect infrastructure, which is physical? Because whenever I think of infrastructure, I think physical things.
Sure.
So if if they say, oh, we lack this particular infrastructure, what I can think about is, where would be funding come for that infrastructure? Do we have the expertise to actually put that infrastructure in place?
Sure.
I do know that collaboration needs to work to make those things happen, but there are still very real points that I think are very key outside of collaboration. For example, funding. And I think you excel at in terms of funding infrastructures in Africa. So for funding infrastructures in Africa, what do you think what some of the major gaps are?
I'll go back to the first point you made. You're right. I don't think collaboration is all. It's not just, if you can have all the collaboration, but if you don't have the funding, you're right. There are gaps there. But I think it's a bedrock. And I think if you don't have, look, someone once told me, he said, somebody who had lived in Nigeria said, your biggest problem is not corruption. Biggest problem is not injustice. Your biggest problem is lack of community. Lack of community it still comes down to collaboration. If somebody says, you know what, I'm going to put my KPI aside and I want to understand, Babatini, what's yours? And how can I help drive yours? And maybe by the time we've worked on yours, then you can come and look at mine. So the private sector and the public sector have to be able to have that conversation. So if you think about just as simple as permitting, when a government agency says, we're not going to give you a permit to do X, Y, Z, and doesn't say, okay, let's try to understand what this person's trying to accomplish. And maybe there are other ways to try to accomplish it. A lot of times it's sort of a binary decision in terms of how they help. Now, all of those things, and I'm using just that example of permitting or the ease of getting permitting, as it flows into the ease of doing business. Whether you like it or not, countries where it is easier to do business, it's faster, will ultimately attract more funding. So the government agencies may not see it, they may see it as them just doing their job to regulate and to say yes and no. But if they see it as not just a yes and no, but okay, what is this person trying to accomplish? What is the socioeconomic impact of what this person is trying to accomplish? If it is worth it, can I find an alternative way to help this person get to their end goal and support them, accordingly? Funding will come to Africa once the willpower and the ability to collaborate effectively is there. I have no doubt about it. Because let's take, for example, the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Project. Again, it had been there for a while, but once there was the willpower and the
funding came.
And the funding came. So when the stars align, when people come from the outside and say, okay, look, how easy is it for us to get our money in, get our money out? Is this country heavily regulated, where again you don't have regulators who are listening, who really want to make the projects come to life and are attracting investments? It will come. I have no doubt about it.
Okay, so you mentioned community,
sure,
which is actually very key. So community in this regard, from what you just said, is the government not just acting as a police force, right? The government acting as also a collaborator in terms of actually also be part of the planning, be part of the vision of what needs to be achieved, right? Quite interesting. So there are also policymakers, right? And I think this is not just unique to Nigeria. Maybe across board, you actually need people to push the policy, because I think the government, I might be wrong, but I think the government is too big to actually be involved in day-to-day, be involved in thinking for you that, this your projects that you as a private company wants to execute would actually positively affect Nigeria. I do know that they still need to do some things around that, but globally, that usually rests on policy and policymakers. So from your experience and view from the private sector, how effective do you think our policymakers have been? And also in terms of private sector collaborating with those policymakers to push the right policies, how easy has that been? And let's say a policy actually went into play, how easy has it been to operationalize that particular policy?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's interesting. Defining government, I think, as executive, right? But the reality is government is executive, legislative, and judiciary. So the policymakers, if I'm hearing you correctly, are part of government. So I wouldn't necessarily separate them. But I think, to your latter question and the latter point that's being made here, and I'll use the Critical National Infrastructure Bill as one that I think had a lot of collaboration between the private sector in the telecom space and policymakers to understand, one, why these assets, the towers, the fiber, data centers, and the like, were critical national infrastructure that needed to be protected at all costs. Prior to the bill being passed, you had some states, or you had some situations, where subnational governments would, because of some, maybe disputes around taxes, would go lock up sites and make them inaccessible. What the CNI bill effectively does is it protects them from that. It says, allow them to run their business. You cannot, under any circumstances, stop them from providing the services because it's a national. It's of national interest. It's to everybody's benefit, and then find other ways to regulate the industry, so to speak, and ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But I think in terms of collaboration, policymakers they're effectively there to help understand first and foremost what is current, what is as is, see the gaps, and help fix them through legislation and policy changes. And I think anybody who's serious about playing in the infrastructure space does have to engage policymakers and spend, probably at some point up to a quarter of one's time in Abuja, trying to help craft and draft the narrative. And I found them to be receptive. I think that over time they've gotten more understanding of the challenges. I think that maybe 10, 15 years ago, when Nigeria was probably in a better economic position, there was a bit more arrogance about the private sector, and they just, but now I think there's a view that, we've got to attract more investments. Our president, I think, is a bit more pro-business. And so the conversations have been good, and they continue to head in the right direction. You just hope the momentum can keep going.
I have a curious question around this policy making and things like that. Very familiar with the American political ecosystem where lobbyists are actually needed, right? So do we have an LD lobbyist ecosystem in Nigeria? And if we do or we don't, do you think it's something that we actually need to develop in any way? And what exactly do you think their duties should actually be?
So, look, there are pros and cons to the American system of lobbying. I think that most countries have some form of lobbying. I think the only difference in the US is that they've made it a bit more open. They've allowed it to be formal so that it's clear what these people's roles and responsibilities are, rather than, nameless, faceless shadows who are there pushing the narrative. So I don't think we have anything formal in Nigeria, but there are people, they're influential people. Sometimes you have legislators who are there because of their knowledge and their know-how, and they understand, so they're there to support the people who have replaced them, and they'll play a role at making the right introductions or framing or giving nuance or context to things that are there. So I don't know if I would call it the formal lobbying, but it happens. You have to be able to take advantage of, because, especially by the nature of our democracy, when we have these 4-year interruptions, so to speak, lots of things change. I don't know what the statistics are, but I think most senators don't get re-elected. So if you're losing about 50% of them every year, and I think it's about similar in the House of Representatives, you're going to lose a lot of knowledge. And I think the people who have been there before have effectively played the role at bridging the gap and helping to create understanding both ways, by the way, not just on the part of, them understanding us, but also us understanding them. Because sometimes I think it's easy for us in the private sector to just say it's government, but I think we also have had to learn how to better gauge their own quote unquote KPIs, what's important to them as legislators, and find ways to frame and shape our own business environments to improve.
Okay, thank you very much. So what I hear is there isn't a formal lobbying ecosystem, but there is no way a lobbying ecosystem doesn't actually exist where there is visible movements, so to speak. Right. Okay. So I think we've really touched a lot on things in and around ATC infrastructure and things like that. But you are no more in ATC. I think you've moved on to higher and bigger roles. Can you elaborate slightly on some of those new roles?
Sure. I mean, as I said, I still play in the infrastructure space, primarily in rail and in telecoms, helping to support telecom rollout in rural communities across Africa. Also trying to help with the resuscitation of a national asset in the traditional telecom space in Nigeria, and the one around the rail, and improving logistics for transportation of cargo from Lagos up north and vice versa. So kind of wearing, as you said, multiple hats and excited about all those projects that I'm on.
For the rural telco rollouts,
yeah.
I did, or I'm still doing some research around that on how important it actually is to have like a penetration of telco into the rural area.
Sure.
Can you expand a bit more around that? First, on the importance of that, and secondly, the sort of work that is currently ongoing around that. And lastly, before you say that, I think there's a company you are currently the CEO of.
Sure.
They might not be that active in Nigeria, but when I looked them up, they were actually active in other parts of Africa.
Sure.
So are you working in any way to make them more active in Nigeria? What sort of learnings are you bringing across board?
Sure. So, the rural conversation is tricky because the likes of the MNOs, one would argue that if it was profitable, they would do it. If it was easy, they would do it. I mean, you have more capital than anybody. But I think it's finding the niches where it's just too much effort for the likes of MTN to go in. So what because you asked about the impact of telecommunications on rural communities, and it's almost indescribable. In the modern era, if you don't have connectivity, you're cut off from obviously things as basic as news. Even more complicated things like access to commerce or commerce trails, access to information, and it limits a lot of options in terms of even education and the like. So what we found in Nigeria is there's still probably about 20 to 25% of the population that is uncovered or limited coverage in terms of their connectivity. So those opportunities are there, but the problem is, how does one find a profitable arm? Because if you think about it, you will not get what we call ARPU in our industry, the average revenue per user, because these are generally less economically stable environments. These aren't people that are necessarily earning blue chip salaries like yourself at MTN. So they're farmers. They're a bit less. So they just even buying a handset sometimes is a bit tricky. So taking advantage of where it does make sense to come up with a low-cost solution, a lot of times not using any generators, just using solar, using some remote optimization and remote tools. So sometimes you might shut down the site, at night where you think that there's no need, and conserve your energy and the like. So that's kind of what the play is. As you mentioned, the companies are big in Nigeria, and it's not, it's not for lack of trying, but the macroeconomic challenges over the last few years have made them a bit hesitant, because again, it's with these sites you have to make money, and you can't make a lot of mistakes. But there's a lot of opportunity outside of Nigeria, and we're focused on wherever it makes sense. In Nigeria, outside of Nigeria. At the end of the day, I think it's about making sure that we make an impact, and that each investment does return, the required return to the investors. And I think it's been an exciting journey so far, finding ways. In many ways, even some of the things that are happening there ultimately will feed back into the traditional telcos. There's learnings for MTN, there's learnings for traditional telcos. And I think in years to come, you see probably a lot more collaboration across all three.
So I don't think a name has been mentioned yet.
We'll leave it like that.
Okay. In terms of learning, because you are the CEO of such a company now,
sure.
And although it's not, they are not operational in Nigeria, but it means you are also getting learnings from other markets.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any like significant things you are seeing from those learnings that you can actually move to Nigeria? Because the key problem you've talked about now is the microeconomic situation we are facing in Nigeria. Apart from that, are there any other things?
I think there are a couple of things. So again, for people who might not know much about the industry, there's something called the Universal Service Provision Fund, which is a subsidy in principle that takes from revenues that the MNOs generate in urban areas, and it's supposed to help subsidize provision of rural telephony. And I think in other African markets, they've been a bit more successful at sort of using that as a way to incentivize. Not so much in Nigeria, but the Nigerian government is actually aggressive about rural telephony, and there's an initiative, I believe, right now with between the Federal Ministry of Communications and the Ministry of Finance to provide up to 7,000 rural communities with coverage. It is a collaboration. We are also talking to them about that. And the reality is that, I think, again, with Nigeria, we go big. I mean, this isn't insignificant. I mean, we're talking about an investment that's probably going to be close to something in the order of $500 million or more to do this. So while the Nigerian government hasn't necessarily, I think, done the best of jobs with the Universal Service Provision Funds, I think they're taking the bull by the horns and they're saying, you know what, we will drive it ourselves and then have the private sector on the back end. But I think in other markets, what we've seen is the other way around. So the private sector actually leading the deployment of these rural sites. So there's lots of things changing in the environment, and I'm sure in the next couple of years we'll see what the results are. Yoruba people say "Onokon Waja," so it's not about one way or the other. But I think the other African markets have been quite helpful in terms of using the access to the fund and making sure that it's adequately distributed.
Right. Let's move quickly to the rail arm of things.
Sure.
Right. I'm actually specifically very interested in that. Right. And the main reason for that is you mentioned something which I already knew outside of the podcast, which is it's many countries actually utilize rails effectively, especially in terms of moving products across, let's say, states or cities, right? And that's possibly something that we lack in currently in Nigeria. How are you looking to solve that currently, and what sort of micro or macro effects do you think that would have?
Okay, so so the proposition is very simple. We have a railway access agreement signed with the National Railway Corporation that allows us to take advantage of the existing infrastructure with some modifications that we're working on to take cargo from Lagos to Kano and back. That's our phase one that I said should be operational in the next year or so. And what we believe is that. Not what we believe, what we've seen so far in talking to potential customers is that the demand is just going to be inexhaustible. So you have primarily what we're talking to are FMCGs who produce goods and services, in Lagos and Ogun State and need to take them up north. Currently, they use trucks to do that. Now, as you can imagine, those trucks are quite heavy, so they put a lot of strain on our road network. They attract a bit of attention, whether it's through bandits, and even some of the law enforcement authorities that sometimes, create a bit of a roadblock.
Also accidents.
Accidents, yes, exactly. So, and when you have sometimes things like flooding, they get stuck. They're quite expensive. They use a lot of diesel and pollute the environment. So the value proposition is very simple. We believe that we will be able to take cargo from Lagos to Kano and vice versa at about 20 to 25% savings on the current model using alternative sources of power. By the way, we are looking at gas as opposed to diesel for our locomotives, and that the effect will be that the road network will be hopefully less under pressure. Goods will get there faster. And there'll be less pilferage and theft along the way because we're going to use containerized solutions. So from point to point, and then we're going to offer things like, they'll have sort of real-time visibility into where their products are. We've heard of cases of diesel truck drivers stopping on the way, selling the product and and disappearing. So, with us, there are lots of the value is endless, and everybody that we've spoken to, whether it's the regulator in our case, whether it's our customers, it's been quite a very receptive reaction to it. And I think the other aspect of it to also note is trying to bring products from the north to the south, some for export, where we will take advantage of some export sort of infrastructure in the north, where they will be able to drop their goods in the north, and that's the last they see of it, because we'll be able to take it straight from there to the ports, and they'll be able to export them. So they get their clearance in Kano for export.
That's actually very, very, very exciting. If implemented, when implemented fully, right? One key thing that I see that needs to come in place is actually investment in the infrastructure to make that happen.
Sure.
Because you obviously will not be using the current Nigerian trains, and I'm not so sure about the rails.
Sure.
If you need to even perform some level of inspection to see if there are certain maintenance or repairs that needs to happen. How is the investment into that going?
Sure.
And how is the planning around that?
So this is a journey of this. We started this about 3 or 4 years ago, so it's not new or novel. We signed the agreement with NRC in 2022. There've been extensive reviews of the infrastructure. It's already baked into our plan, and work is ongoing. The locomotives are being designed and will be ready, like I said, next year from China. We were in China a couple of months ago, doing our final technical evaluations with the OEM that's making it in China, the world's largest railway and railway stock manufacturer in China. So it's not going to come without its challenges. We're not going to pretend that it's not. It's actually why we're taking on very limited in our phase one. We're not looking at any of the other because there are multiple rail networks, but we're only looking at Lagos to Kano for our phase one. And we want to be comfortable with that first before we venture into the others, and we'll see how it shapes up. But it's exciting. Even when we fix the infrastructure, there's going to be continuous maintenance on those sites. We've got to look at things like security across, the track, and making sure that we'll go with the right personnel, but you also don't want to attract the wrong element in there. Having the right insurance, having the right health and safety, having the right security mechanisms in place, taking advantage of CCTV where it makes sense. So there are lots of things operationally that we anticipate that we'll have to work on, but it's why we're here.
Okay, I look forward to that being fully implemented, because I actually see a lot of effects across micro and macro effects across the economy as a whole when it is fully implemented. I would like to dial back away slightly from work.
Sure.
And focus a bit more on the person, being you.
Sure.
Right? Can you speak a bit more to your experience, or I would say childhood experience and education, that made you someone as capable now to be able to handle so many things that I would personally classify as complex? And so your experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think maybe before education, I'll talk about my parents. I think I had two very different parents who brought two very different things to the table and probably helped shape who I am. So my mother was more of a traditional conservative. She was a teacher, and it was tough, right? She was very strict and didn't have much appetite for things like creativity or even football. I remember I got in trouble a few times. My primary school being a few minutes away from here, where I wasn't, she didn't really encourage me participating in sports because she thought it took time away from my academics. And my father, who's maybe more of a free spirit and encouraged us to kind of, be ourselves and be who we wanted to be. And so in going to university, I was quite torn about what I really wanted to do and what I wanted to study, but I was comfortable, good at math. And so I just kept going and ended up with the first degree in applied mathematics almost by mistake. And maybe the more creative side of me allowed me or encouraged me to study abroad, and actually ended up spending 2 years in Spain during my undergrad. and learning Spanish and, feeling like, okay, I can do something, by myself, quote unquote, and try something new. And it was a great experience, maybe the best 2 years of my life from a social perspective. And then, subsequently, again, with my creative streak, I like to design, I like to draw. My parents weren't keen on paying for an arts degree at the time, or a degree in art or fine art. So I managed to convince them to allow me go to architecture school, which in my head was sort of a mix of art and the math or more technical aspects. Studying architecture was interesting. Did that alongside several internships, which gave me insights into what an architect actually did on a day-to-day basis. It was very romantic to look at it from a distance, but getting into it, I felt like it would constrain me because I quickly realized I was very restless and I wanted to do so many things. So it then became a choice of, do I just sort of stick this thing out and build this career? I chose not to. So I went into consulting almost immediately after my degree in architecture, and it gave me an opportunity to try different things, to work in different sectors and different fields, and then capped it off with an MBA, and then actually went into workforce properly. My career was always built around strategy, business development, commercial negotiations and the like, which again, I think speaks to kind of being free, taking a base or a foundation and having creative solutions to very difficult problems. So I think, again, going back to, rather than just the education itself, I think it was my parents and having the very, very different people and having the benefit of balancing both that sort of creative free spirit side with a bit more, sort of rubber to the road, let's get things done.
Is there a key point or a key experience that actually made you make that shift from the architecture career angle to where you are currently? Was there a particular key point apart from being restless? Because I know
it's a good point or question. I was actually about to graduate from architecture school. I had a job. I was going to take the job in architecture. But I started to talk to a couple of friends about some doubts that I had. And they said, you don't have to do this if you don't want to do it, which wasn't anything for me, it was like, okay, you have a job, you go take the job, of course. It was the only job I had. But instead, I chose to stay an extra semester in school and explore. So I didn't take any architecture classes in my other than my thesis, which I extended. I didn't take any architecture classes in my last semester. I started to, I took classes in the business school at the time and got to see a different side of life. So I think being open and vulnerable to people that I trusted, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. There are lots of blind spots that we all have. So perspectives come a lot of times from being vulnerable to the right sets of people, and they get you to see a world outside of that. Even when I think about going to study in Spain, I mean, it wasn't something that any of my peers was doing at the time, and I was just talking to a few people and seeing opportunities. So I think I've been fortunate to be surrounded by mentors, friends, peers who have helped me see opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't have been. Relationships are key. Also being able to give it forward or pay it forward. So I would like to believe that I've also been able to help people see, opportunities that maybe were not apparent to them, right off the bat.
Right. You're a very busy person. How do you balance, I won't say work-life balance, and majorly minus work? What other hobbies do you get involved in?
I don't know if I'll call this a hobby, but I've managed to incorporate exercise into my life every day. Except for Sundays, I'm usually at the gym for about an hour and a half to start my day. Helps clear my mind, helps prepare for the day mentally. And it's the one thing I think I do for myself, like absolutely 100% for me. Because, my wife would argue that there are other ways to make sure that you're healthy, and going to the gym 6 days a week for her isn't the best use of my time. But it's for me. Let me make that abundantly clear. In addition to that, I told you, my social circles are strong. I have quite a wide range of friends that help keep me, honest. And I've tried to get into golf. I struggle with that. Watching the football every now and then is also quite fun. I'm more of a maybe one of the last standing Nigeria fans over. I support Arsenal, but I will watch a Nigeria game over an Arsenal game any day, anytime.
Right. So for young people out there that are hoping to have the sort of career that you have, and I see you as a sort of inspiration, like I do see you right now. What sort of advice would you give them? Because I do know that you overcome many challenges, and I'm sure certain things also fell in place, right? I'm sure some of them right now are either at the stage of overcoming certain challenges. Some of them right now probably feel like things are not falling in place. And maybe for some, things are starting to fall in place. What sort of advice would you give them?
I say stay curious. So our educational system, I think, can be a bit constraining. So I went to secondary school here in Lagos and had very strong, teachers who supported, but they were very prescriptive. So they said, this is the way the world is, right? This is the definition of that. And I think it was until I left that I got an opportunity to really look at things and challenge a lot of the things that I held to be true. People nowadays don't have to subscribe to only what they hear from their teachers or what they read in textbooks or maybe the encyclopedia. The world is their oyster. The other day, I came across a young lady on Instagram who speaks Korean. She's never been to Korea, doesn't know a single Korean person, but I think she just started watching the K-pop dramas or K-dramas, I'm not sure what they're called, and decided that she wanted to learn it. To the point where she goes on these video calls with Koreans and they're shocked that not only does she speak Korean, she speaks it with a native accent.
Right.
Now, that's the world that we live in. It's a level of curiosity. So you can do almost anything. You don't necessarily have to have an opportunity to go abroad. But I think if you're curious, if you work hard, you will make whatever it is. And I don't think anybody should necessarily try to follow me. I think everybody will find their own path. But I think that ability to stay curious and challenge everything will serve people, I think, the best. That's the one thing I would encourage them to do.
Thank you very much for coming on the show. I know you probably have a million places that you could be right now. Thank you so much for coming to share your experience and knowledge with us.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.